Welcome to History on Drugs. Today we're going to talk about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, uh, which happened in the 1860s here in America. And we're going to talk about how fucked up the 25,000-ish laborers that worked to build the railroad were. From alcohol to drugs, it was a party literally steamrolling across the country in two directions. So up until the 1860s in America, we had railroads, right? Primarily in the Northeast, in the New York City area, in Baltimore, and they were building them in the South too. And railroads became a pretty big undertaking in our country in like the 1830s and 40s. They started laying more and more track to connect cities and ports to just expand commerce and trade and to move agricultural, which really just kind of boomed the economy in some places. But in the 1860s, most of the railroad that existed was controlled in the North. So the Union Army had a huge advantage over the Confederates because they could more easily move men, ammunitions, and supplies into battlefields or into setup areas before they launched battles. But hey, this is America. When we go big, we go fucking big. In 1861, right when the Civil War started, legislation was brought up and passed by Abe Lincoln. Abe Lincoln was the fucking man. Like, here he is dealing with a war, and he's also helping to oversee the legislation that would lead to creating one of the most technological like feats of the 19th century, and it would change America forever. So let's talk about it a little bit. So they passed the law because Congress, like originally, Southern senators wanted the railroad that would connect the East to the Western United States to run through the South, obviously. And their argument was they didn't have to go through mountains and horrible weather, and they could avoid a lot of the more dangerous Native American lands. Of course, Northern senators were like, nope, we're going to run it through the North because every state that had the railroad through it was going to benefit. Ultimately, when it went to Congress in the early 1860s, it passed overwhelmingly without any Southern votes because they were too busy trying to succeed from the United States. So they weren't in Congress. They had no representation. So the route to connect the East United States to the West United States via railroad would come through Omaha and Nebraska and a place called, I think, Council Bluffs. And then it would go all the way through the plains, into the mountains, into Sacramento, then on to San Francisco and down California, right? Which would be a game changer. So up until this point, if you wanted to travel from New York City to San Francisco, you had three options. Well, you had more, but three main options. You could take a ship all the way down around South America and all the way back up to the California coast. And that trip would take you I think 4 to 6 months. I don't know, maybe even more, but that's dangerous. Just the amount of disease being on a ship that long, piracy, and of course the dangerous waters and the unknown navigation at the time. You could also take a ship down to Central America, where the Panama Canal was. It is today. It didn't exist back then. And in that area, you would get on canoes, go through some, I would guess, rainforest or jungle, travel overland, get to the other side, get on another boat, come all the way up through the Pacific Ocean to California. Wow, that's another crazy trip. Or you could do it like we see in every movie and the old Western expansion. You could get yourself a wagon train going with a bunch of wagons, some horses, load everything in the wagon and start making the 6 month to a year trek across this country, which was incredibly dangerous, not just because of the weather and the terrain, but because you were going into unknown territory with predators and animals and the Native American Indians that like didn't want you there. This was their land for thousands and thousands, over 10,000 years. This was their land. So we can understand why they would push back. They've already been driven from the Atlantic Ocean and the eastern shores to the west. And over hundreds of years, they had to move west of the Mississippi and into the northern United States. But the building of the railroad would just ruin the future goals and dreams of all Native Americans, and they would be secluded to reservations. Their land would be destroyed. And one of the things that was really important to the Native Americans was the buffalo, right? I think there was millions of roaming wild buffalo that for thousands of years, the Native Americans, that's how they settled. They followed wherever the buffalo went, the herds of buffalo, they went. And then they hunted the buffalo, and it was very spiritual. And they used every piece of the buffalo, from the bone to the teeth to the innards to the pelts to eating the meat, right? And it was sacred. And this would be a huge issue for the Indians, because as the railroad tracks start getting laid, the railroad tracks getting laid. I don't know about those buffalo. Stupid dad joke. I apologize. Anyhow, the buffalo started like standing on the track. And then as they built the track, their trains couldn't go by. So the railroad workers just started like shooting buffalo. And over like a 5 or 6 year period, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of buffalo were killed. And it would deplete their population to a scarcity. And it would no longer be a cultural thing or a ritual that these Indians can pursue. The buffalo were all but gone. The railroad was also a huge money grab. So there would be two companies building this railroad through the Central Plains to California. One would be the Union Pacific, right? And they would start in Nebraska, and the other was the Central Pacific. And I always screw them up because you would think Central would be in Nebraska, but it's not. The Union Pacific would start in like the Midwest. And then the Central Pacific would start building in Sacramento, where they already had tracks laid. All right, so let's focus on how messed up these dudes were getting, on what drugs and how much alcohol were they consuming. So for the Union Pacific, they hired about somewhere between 8 and 10,000 workers. And these laborers came from, a lot of them were Irish immigrants coming from the cities. Like a huge majority of them at the Union Pacific were Irish immigrants. Also, because the railroad it didn't really start getting in gear till 1863, 64, 65. So as the Civil War ended, soldiers from the South and the North that were displaced, they had no jobs or homes to go to, they would go work on the railroad. And also, they would be working right next to freed slaves that now needed work too. So hundreds and hundreds of slaves also went to work on the railroad. They were no longer slaves. They got paid like everybody else. So obviously there was a lot of discrimination and fights and cultural issues. What sprung up building this railroad would be coined in 1869 by the editor of a newspaper in Springfield, Mass, as a town called Hell on Wheels. It was a roaming town that moved with the railroad. And so as these laborers would lay track, whether it was a mile a day or 5 miles a day, when they got far out in the middle of nowhere, they had no resources. They had no bucket trucks or backhoes or heavy machinery. This was all being done by hand. They were laying the steel tracks and moving the iron and all the, they would call it drills, but the drills were just like metal spikes that they banged. They had people grading the area. And also they would send people out as they were laying the tracks to mine for minerals in that area, because like the Union Pacific now had the rights to like a 20-mile radius to any mineral mining they could do. So they were just absorbing other ways to make money off the land. But as that track moved, this town Hell on Wheels would set up, right? Tents would pop up, wood structures would pop up, written and painted signs would pop up. There'd be a church, a saloon, of course, the brothel, and a commissary, like a little store to get things. But because of the majority of Irish immigrants, and of course the ex-soldiers going through the trauma of war, and the free slaves that were enslaved for generations, they were all drinking. And they were drinking whiskey, and all the best whiskey went into the saloons, which, if you had money, the Irish immigrants and the ex-soldiers, mostly white, would go into the saloons and they would drink all the whiskey. So to create more whiskey to help sustain the demand for it, there would be so many additives like put into it that were actually dangerous. So a lot of people would get sick consuming whiskey at these saloons because it was so diluted with shit, much like in season 1, we had a prohibition episode where America outlawed alcohol, so illegal smugglers were making their own alcohol, and it could be poisonous and dangerous. Also, there was moonshiners that would move along with the railroad and sell and trade their moonshine. And then there was some pretty shitty beer. The preservative, it wouldn't preserve well at the time, so it wasn't as popular as like the grog that the freed slaves would drink, or the homemade moonshine, or the whiskey in the saloons. So they were getting so drunk that the alcohol was like a problem, but also a tool, because to deal with all the pain and the labor of, lifting structures and working under these conditions, like, you're going to drink to deal with it. So people were drinking in the day, they were drinking at the night, and it created towns and just rowdiness, or created violence and rowdiness. And there was often fights. Obviously, Southern soldiers would fight with the freed black slaves, and the Irish immigrants would run their mouth and fight with ex-Northern military. So people were getting murdered and killed, and then the prostitutes were getting murdered and killed, but there was prostitution everywhere. And then the opium and the morphine were also getting into the camps. And then peddlers would come along, and they were adding cocaine, which has started gaining popularity in the late 1860s. So now you could buy a cigarette that had cocaine in it, you're smoking a coolie, or you could chew gum that had cocaine in it, or you could just sniff it up the nose. So you had cocaine, opium, and tons of alcohol just funneling through the railroad workers, and it created chaos, thus the name Hell on Wheels. So the town would be a disaster. It would pick up and move down the tracks again. Now, what was really challenging as they built the railroad is there was no water, right? So, there was huge health concerns, right? If you were drinking dirty water, dysentery was a huge problem, and they would treat it with opium, right? You would just get high on an opiate, like heroin or morphine. It wasn't heroin back then, but the same idea. So these towns were just so dirty and just always on the move, and people were scamming and robbing, and there was a lot of racism and discrimination, and there was no law, right? So obviously they all faced a problem that they had to deal with together pretty soon as they expanded through Nebraska into Native American territory. The Indians didn't want them there, so a lot of them did whatever they had to do to push the building of the railroad back. Right? So they would attack the little towns and the encampments and the builders on the railroad and the laborers. There was tons and tons of fights and murders. And so eventually the U.S. Army had to come out. And when Grant, I don't know if Grant was running for president at the time. This was post-Civil War. So he was helping to help push the Indians out. We offered them land and reservations. So the Army came out to clear the railroad, but they also used it as a cover to just start annihilating Indians and pushing them back. So it was really dirty and scary and hard to work on the railroad. And the only thing you had to use to cope with it was drugs and alcohol, right? And they were just... It's amazing that they could build something so precise. There was engineers checking the work because they wouldn't get paid by the U.S. government if it wasn't laid properly. And there was a lot of scams going on with the building of the railroad. The Union Pacific was led by a guy named Thomas Durant, who was one of the country's biggest frauds of all time. He set up a shell corporation to illegally funnel money and double bill himself, all kinds of good stuff. But what he did was he knew he was getting paid in government bonds per mile. The government offered $16,000 to $18,000 per mile of railroad track laid once it was inspected. if you had to go up a grade and it became harder to lay, they'd go all the way up to $48,000 a mile. So what Durant did was he didn't run a straight line. He wanted to make money. So the railroad would be built with zigzags and curves and just do so much unnecessary bullshit because he wanted to get paid more and more by the government. So as Hell on Wheels rolled through the Central Plains to get to the mountains, they were doing it high on drugs and drinking copious amounts of whiskey and moonshine. On the other side of the country, the Central Pacific was coming from Sacramento to meet the Union Pacific. And they both wanted to beat each other because that would be more track laid, meaning they would make more money from the government. But the Central Pacific had some challenges. They had to go through some serious mountain terrain right out of the gate, the Sierra Nevadas and parts of the Rocky Mountains and other mountain areas. So the Central Pacific hired like 12 to 15,000 Chinese workers, right? Which was like, oh, everybody hated them. They treated them worse than African Americans. There was so much racism and prejudice against the Chinese workers. And it started when they came during the gold rush of the 1840s. They came through San Francisco and they were really hard workers and they were very communal and they stuck together, and the way they operated when they weren't working was a little bit healthier than the Irish immigrants and the dirty way of life in Hell on Wheels in the Central Plains. And we're going to talk a little bit about that soon. So they hired all these Chinese workers, and the Chinese workers would get paid less originally, but they would also get paid through like a pimp, right? So one guy would be like, okay, I'll get you thousands of workers. You pay me, I'll pay the workers. So they were setting it up as like $30 to $35 a month for the Chinese workers, but the pimp would like obviously sift off the top. And that pimp was also a resource for opium, right? And morphine or rice wine or whatever you needed. So just like in the Midwest, they were setting up little encampments as they moved along, and it was different. It was actually a lot more sanitary because of the amount of Chinese working. And what they would do is they boiled their water so they didn't have as much dysentery because they drank so much tea, and that kept them healthy. And they also ate healthier meats, and they boiled their meats, and their diets were different in the amount of rice they consumed. So they were able to work harder, sustain tougher labor, and just be quicker with building the railroad because they were healthier. But they were also doing drugs and drinking, and they were smoking copious amounts of opium. And we know this because archaeologists who have gone back to follow the original path of the railroad started uncovering where the Chinese workers were established, and they uncovered all these pipes for opium, which we knew it was a cultural thing anyhow that had been going on in China for hundreds of years. And actually just before this was the Opium Wars in China, where Great Britain dumped tons and tons and tons of opium on the Chinese people, even though the government was like, go away, we have a problem here. So you can go to season 1 and check out the Opium Wars episode. It's pretty wild to see how the great, like the English crown and some other like global powers just got the country re-addicted to opium. So the Chinese, it was a long tradition of them to smoke opium, but they wouldn't get rowdy like the Irish immigrants that were drinking whiskey. They would just smoke it and relax to help deal with the pain and use it as a tool to just help manage the stress of the labor that was going on. The Chinese workers also took so many more risks when they were building the railroads because they were going through the mountains. And imagine digging tunnels through the mountains with like no tools, like you just like chipping away. They would literally move like 6 inches to a foot a day. So in the beginning, they were using black powder, right? They would light it, it would blow up, giant chunks of rocks would fall. It was very dangerous. Thousands of Chinese laborers got killed. There's no exact number as to how many, but we know it was in the thousands. And after a while, they started using nitroglycerin, which would make a bigger blast, but it would blow the rock chunks into smaller pieces that were easier to clear and manage, but it was much more dangerous to handle. So the Chinese were climbing mountains, doing dangerous jobs, all while going back to their encampment and getting high on opium. Now, here's something interesting. I put two and two together during my research. We talked in like episode 2 or 3 about drugs in ancient Egypt, which is pretty cool. But there's a whole thing about the building of the pyramids and do the aliens do it as a scam? How did they do it? Who knows? Now, we talked about the Ebers Papyrus, which lays out evidence that they were actually moving the stones from a quarry across the Nile. There was more water. They actually like redirected the Nile so they could bring these shipments of giant stones closer to where they were building the pyramid. There's evidence of that. It's written on the Ebers Papyrus discovered in 2014. But then people are like, well, yeah, sure, but how they build it? They couldn't get it up there. They didn't have tools. Well, let me tell you what the Chinese did, and it is documented, and this is how they did it. They moved a steam locomotive, multiple, up the mountains. They didn't have machines or tools. They took wood, logs, and pork grease, and they roped them, and they would use hundreds of workers to just slowly pull inch by inch over days and maybe weeks sometimes to get it up where it had to go. Boom. Those steam locomotives were about 20 tons. So if the Chinese could do it with pork grease, wood, and rope by just using power, and organized labor, obviously the Egyptians building the pyramids could do something similar, right? It's not impossible. So that just kind of hit me during some of this research. And we do know, I don't want to go into an Egypt thing, but just go back and listen to the episode on Egypt. We show how they lower a 40,000 pound like tomb by using sand and rope into its place. So they could obviously get stuff up by getting creative like the Chinese did while building the railroad. So the Chinese brought this culture of opium smoking, which spread to the Americans out west. So at this time in the late 1860s on the East Coast, the Civil War had ended and hundreds of thousands of soldiers were addicted to opium and morphine that they were getting from injuries on the battlefield. On the West Coast, tens of thousands. I think there was like 70, 80, 90,000 Chinese in the San Francisco area, and they brought with them a way of smoking opium, mixing it with tobacco and a little gummy ball, or just a gummy ball of opium that they'd often put with a little tobacco. They'd light it in a pipe over a candle, and you just chill and be high as fuck. So when the railroad was complete, they started opening opium dens in what was called Chinatown in San Francisco. And then in 1876, America saw its first drug law. They banned only Chinese opium dens, right? Only Chinese opium dens, right? Because opium was legal. So you could have a white opium den, but they banned, it became a law in California that there could be no Chinese opium dens. And the fear was that white women were going in there. Once white women and, young white men were going in to rot their brains and smoke their life away, government officials got involved. And it turns out, like through literature, research, and documents, that actually is not true. It was just a form of racism to use the power of legislations against the Chinese people. But what sprung out of these opium dens and the communal aspect of the Chinese laborers that came for the gold rush and then by the thousands to work on the railroad, Chinatowns would start popping up in cities all over America. We have them today. I'm sure if you're in the East Coast, you've gone to Chinatown in New York City. It's awesome, right? You get a little bit of the culture. But that's how it started because there was so much racism that they were kind of just secluded to this area. So they really stuck together. And the smoking of opium built these dens, which brought other people into the Chinatown area to help get a taste of their culture that they would come back out and have their own addiction to opium. So building the railroad, it really didn't start like moving until like 1863, 1864, 1865, and then post-Civil War. It was built 1,900 miles of track would connect the East Coast to the West Coast. And now America would change forever because now you didn't have to risk those wagon trains across the United States. You just jumped on the train. It took 7 days from New York to San Francisco. That's not bad. There were issues. The trains would crash. Bridges would fail, the Indians would still attack, but for the most part, this would be the future of America, and it would expand industry. And now we have more steel and iron and wood and products, and merchandise was able to trade and move quicker. And this leads us into the Gilded Age in America, where the robber barons, which would be a handful of very wealthy people like the Astors, my brain, I can't think, but all the Carnegies, right? They were controlling all the wealth of America, and the railroad system would certainly help them. Certainly Carnegie, who was in the industry itself. So the railroad moved the country back and forth, moved products. It helped America boom. The people that built it, they were getting fucked up. They were getting fucked up in a couple of different ways. Which is interesting, right? The West Coast thing and the East Coast thing. So lots of corruption. No one ever went to jail for it. Thomas Durant and the workers on both the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, they were funneling money, stealing from the government. Abe Lincoln was distracted at the time. He had a war going on. But it was a pretty crazy thing. And then in 1869, boom, there it is. America as we know it today. Once you could crisscross the country, where people just started coming by the thousands, pushing the Indians back, settling along the way. Towns like Cheyenne popped up, and all over Utah popped up, and into California, and Lake Tahoe, and then cities just started popping up along the railroad because you can get there, and it would be everything to this country, but just like everything else we talk about in this show, drugs and alcohol played a huge part in how the laborers dealt with their daily problems. So I think this is pretty cool. If you want to learn more about this, I know it's dramatized. There's a great show that was on a few years ago on, I think, AMC. It's called Hell on Wheels. It's about the town, right? That was coined, Hell on Wheels. It's got a few of the characters. It's not real because it's TV, but it really shows the labor and what they went through, and I think it's a great place to go to learn more about it. Anyways, that's History on Drugs, talking about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and we'll see you back soon. You can always email me at historyondrugspodcast@gmail.com.